Hello, it's Amy, and I'm here with the next chapter of Points of View by Agnes Repplier. Today's chapter is titled Literary Shibboleths. There is a delightful little story, very well told by Mr. James Payn, the novelist, about an unfortunate young woman who for years concealed in her bosom the terrible fact that she did not think John Giplin funny, and who at last, in an unguarded moment, confessed to him her guilty secret, and was promptly comforted by the assurance that, for his part, he had always found it dull. The weight that was lifted from that girl's mind made her feel for the first time that she was living in an age which tolerates freedom of conscience, and in a land where the Holy Office is unknown. It is only to be feared that her newly acquired liberty inclined her to be as much of a Philistine as Mr. Payn himself, and to believe with him that all orthodoxy is of necessity hypocritical, and that when a man says he admires the Fairy Queen or Paradise Lost or Rabelais, the chances are that he knows little or nothing about them. Now, as a matter of fact, it is seldom safe to judge others too rigidly by our own inadequate standards, or to assume that because we prefer in memoriam to Lycidas, our friend is merely adopting a tone of grievous superiority when he modestly but firmly asserts his preference for the earlier dirge. It is even possible that although we may find Don Quixote dull and the Excursion vapid, another reader, no whit cleverer, we are sure, than ourselves, may enjoy them both with honest laughter and with keen delight. There is doubtless as much affection in the world of books as in the world of art and fashion, but there must always be a certain proportion of men and women who, whether by natural instinct or acquired grace, derive pleasure from the highest ranks of literature, and who should, in common justice, be permitted to say so, and to return thanks for the blessing accorded them. It is in our power to think as we will, says Marcus Aurelius, and it should be our farther privilege to give unfettered expression to our thoughts. Nevertheless, human nature is weak and erring, and the pitfalls dug for us by wily critics are baited with the most ensnaring devices. It is not the great writers of the world who have the largest following of sham admirers, but rather that handful of choice spirits who, we are given to understand, appeal only to a small and chosen band. Few of us find it worth our while to pretend a passionate devotion for Shakespeare or Milton or Dante. On the contrary, nothing is more common than to hear people complain that the Inferno is unpleasant and Paradise Lost dreadfully long, neither of which charges is easily refutable in terms. But when we read in a high-class review that Justice Spencer is the poet's poet, so Peacock is the delight of critics and of wits, or that George Meredith, writing as he does for an essentially cultivated and esoteric audience, has won but a limited recognition for his brilliant group of novels, or that the subtle and far-reaching excellence of Isbin's dramatic work is a quality absolutely undecipherable to the groundlings, who can resist tendering his allegiance on the spot? It is not in the heart of man to harden itself against the allurements of that magic word esoteric, nor to be indifferent to this distinction it conveys. Mr. Payn, indeed, in a robust spirit of contradiction, has left it on record that he found Headlong Hall and Crotchet Castle intolerably dull, but this I believe to have been an unblushing falsehood, in the case of the latter story at least. It is hardly within the bounds of possibility that a man blessed with so keen a sense of humor could have found the Reverend Dr. Follett dull, but it is quite possible that the average reader whose humorous perceptions are of a somewhat restricted nature should find Mr. Peacock enigmatic, and that the oppressive brilliancy of Mr. Meredith's novel a heavy load to bear. There is such a thing as being intolerably clever, and Evan Harrington and The Egoist are fruitful examples of the fact. The mind is kept on a perpetual strain, lest some fine play of words, some elusive witticism, should be disregarded. The sense of continued effort paralyzes enjoyment. Fatigue provokes us in an ignoble spirit of contrariety, and we sigh perversely for that serene atmosphere of dullness which, in happier moments, we affected to despise. A man, says Dr. Johnson bluntly, ought to read just as inclination leads him, for what he reads as a task will do him little good. In other words, if his taste is for Mr. Rider Haggard's ingenious tales, it is hardly worth his while to pretend that he prefers Tolstoy. His more enlightened brother will indeed pass him by with a shiver of pained surprise, but he has the solid evidence of the booksellers to prove that he is not sitting alone in his darkness. Yet nowadays the critic diverts his heaviest scorn from the guilty author who does not mind it at all, to the sensitive reader who minds it a great deal too much. And the result is that cowardice prompts a not unnatural deception. Few of us remember what Dr. Johnson chanced to say on the subject, and still fewer are prepared to solace ourselves with his advice. But when an unsparing disciplinarian like Mr. Friedrich Harrison lays down the law with a chastening hand, we are all of us aroused to a speedy and bitter consciousness of our deficiencies. The incongruable habit of reading little books. A habit, one might say, analogous to that of eating common food, meets with scant tolerance at the hands of this inexorable reformer. Better, far better, never to read at all, and so keep the mind open and healthy, than be betrayed into seeking desultory information from the rank and file of literature. To be simply entertained by a book is an unpardonable sin. To be greatly instructed is very little better. In fact, Mr. Harrison carries his severity to such a pitch that on reaching this humiliating but comforting sentence, systematic reading in its true sense is hardly possible for women, it was with a feeble gasp of relief that I realized our ignominious exclusion from the race. I do not see why systematic reading should be hardly possible for women, any more than I see what is to become of Mr. Harrison if we are to give up little books. But never before did the limitations of sex appear in so friendly a light. There is something frightful in being required to enjoy and appreciate all masterpieces, to read with equal relish Milton and Dante, and Calderon and Goethe, and Homer and Scott, and Voltaire and Wordsworth and Cervantes, and Molière and Swift. One is irresistibly reminded of Mrs. Blimber surveying the infant Paul Dombey. Like a bee, she murmured, about to plunge into a garden of the choicest flowers and sip the sweet for the first time. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Terence, Plautus, Cicero, what a world of honey have we here, and what a limited appetite and digestion awaited them. After all, these great men did not invariably love one another, even when they had the chance. Goethe, for instance, hated Dante, and Scott very cordially disliked him. Voltaire had scant sympathy with Paradise Lost, and Wordsworth focused his true affections upon the children of his own pen. It is very amusing to see the position now assigned by critics to that arch offender, Charles Lamb, who himself, the idlest of readers, had no hesitation in commending the same unscrupulous methods to his friends. We are told in one breath of his unerring literary judgment, and in the next are solemnly warned against accepting that judgment as our own. He is the most quoted because the most quotable of writers, yet everyone who uses his name seems faintly displeased at hearing it upon another's lips. I have myself been reminded with some sharpness by a reviewer that illustrations drawn from Lamb counted for nothing in my argument, because his was a unique personality, a pure imagination which even the drama of the Restoration could not pollute. But this seems to be assuming more than we have any right to assume. I cannot take it upon myself to say, for example, that Mr. Bagehot's mind was more susceptible to pollution than Charles Lamb's. I am not sufficiently in the secrets of Providence to decide upon so intimate and delicate a question. But granted that others have a clearer light on these matters than I have, it would still appear as though the unpolluted source were the best friend from which to draw one's help and inspiration. What really makes Lamb a doubtful guide through the mazes of literature is the fact that there is not a single rule given to us in these sober days for the proper administration of our faculties, which he did not take a positive pleasure in transgressing. His often quoted heresy in regard to these volumes, which no gentleman's library should be without, might perhaps be spared the serious handling it receives, but his letters abound in the passages equally shameless and perverting. I feel as if I had read all the books I want to read, he writes unconcernedly, and again, I take less pleasure in reading than henceforth, but I like books about books, and so alas do we. Though this is the most serious charge laid at our doors, and one which has subjected us to the most humiliating reproofs. It is very pleasant to have Mr. Anger tell us what an admirable critic Lamb was, and with that unerring certainty, he pointed out the best lines of Wordsworth and Southey and Coleridge. The fact remains, though, to this, Mr. Anger does not draw our attention that he found nothing to praise in Byron, heartily disliked Shelley, never so far as we can see read Keats, condemned Faust unhesitatingly as a disagreeable canting tale of seduction, and discovered strong points of resemblance between Southey and Milton. Under these circumstances, it is hardly safe to elect him as a critical fetish if we feel the need of such an article merely because he admired the Ancient Mariner and Blake's Chimney Sweeper, and did not particularly admire We Are Seven. Even his fine and subtle sympathy with Shakespeare is a thing to be revered and envied, rather than analyzed and drawn into service, where it will answer little purpose. But what is none the less sure is that Lamb recognized by swift and delicate intuition the literary food that was best fitted to nourish his own intellectual growth. This was Sir Walter Scott's secret, and this was Lamb's. Both knew instinctively what was good for them, and a clear perception of our individual needs is something vastly different from idle preference based on an ignorant conceit. It is what we have each of us to learn if we would hope to thrive. And while we may be aided in the effort, yet a general command to read and enjoy all great authors seldom affords us the precise assistance we require. Still less do we derive any real help from those more contentious critics who, being wedded hard and fast to one particular author or to one particular school of thought, refuse with ostentatious continency to cast lingering looks upon any other type of loveliness. Literary monogamy, as practiced by some of our contemporaries, makes us sigh for the old genial days of Priest Martin, when the tyranny of opinions had not yet grown into a binding yoke, and when it was still possible to follow the example of Montaigne's old woman and light one candle to St. Michael and another to the dragon. At present, the saint, or perhaps the dragon, stands in a blaze of glory, all the more illustrious for the dark shadow thrown on his antagonist. Praise handed in by disparagement, the Greek drama whipped upon the back of Genesis, if I may venture to quote Charles Lamb again. This is the modern method of procedure, a method successfully inaugurated by Macaulay, who could find no better way of eulogizing Addison than by heaping antithetical reproaches upon Steele. In a little volume of lectures upon Russian literature, lectures which were sufficiently popular to bear both printing and delivery, I find the art of persuasiveness illustrated by this firebrand of a sentence, hurled like an anathema at the heads of a peaceful and unoffending community. Read Tolstoy, read humbly, read admirably. Reading him in this spirit shall in itself be unto you an education of your highest artistic nature, and when your souls have become able to be thrilled in their very depths by the unspeakable beauty of Tolstoy's art, you will learn to be ashamed of the thought that for years you sensible folks of Boston have been capable of allowing the Stevensons with their Hydes and the Haggards with their Shees and even the clumsy Wards with their ponderous Ellesmeres to steal away under the flag of literature your thoughtful moments. Now, apart from the delightful vagueness of perspective, for Robert Ellesmere and she grouping together amicably together is a spectacle too pleasant to be lost, I cannot but think that there is something oppressive about the form in which these comments are offered to the world. It reminds one of that highly dramatic scene in Bulwer's Richelieu, where the aged cardinal hurls the curse of Rome at a whole stage full of people who shrink and cower without knowing very distinctly at what. Why should critics, I wonder, always adopt this stringent and defiant tone when they would beguile us with the enjoyment of Russian fiction? Why should the reading of Tolstoy necessarily imply a contempt for Robert Louis Stevenson? Why, when we have been thrilled to our very depths by Peace and War or Anna Karenina, should we not devote a few spare moments to the consideration of Markham, a story whose solemn intensity of purpose in no way mars its absolute and artistic beauty? And why, above all, should we be perpetually reprimanded, like so many stupid and obstinate children? I cannot even think that Mr. Howells is justified in calling the English nation those poor islanders, as if they were dancing naked somewhere in the South Seas, merely because they love George Eliot and Thackeray, as well as Jane Austen. They love Jane Austen too. We all love her right heartily, but we have no need to emulate good Queen Anne, who, as Swift observed, had not a sufficient stock of amity for more than one person at a time. We may not indeed be prepared to say with Mr. Howells that Miss Austen is the first and the last of the English novelists to treat material with entire truthfulness, having some reasonable doubt as to the precise definition of truth. We may not care to emphasize our affection for her by repudiating with one breath all her great successors. We may not even consider the Newcomes and Henry Esmond as illustrating the degeneracy of modern fiction. Yet, nevertheless, we may enjoy some fair half hours in the company of Emma Woodhouse and Mr. Elton of Catherine Morland and Elizabeth Bennet. Only when we are searching for a shibboleth by which to test our neighbour's intellectual worth, let not Jane Austen's be the name, lest we be rewarded for our trouble by hearing the faint, clear ripple of her amused laughter, that gentle, feminine, merciless laughter, echoing softly from the dwelling place of the immortals. It is inevitable, moreover, that too much rigidity on the part of teachers should be followed by a brisk spirit of insubordination on the part of the taught. Accordingly, now and then some belligerent freeman rushes into print and shakes our souls by declaring breathlessly that he hates Wagner and Mr. Irving and Elgin Marbles and Goethe and Leonardo da Vinci, and this rank of socialism in literature and art receives a very solid and shameless support from the more light-minded writers of the day. Mr. Burrell, for instance, fails to see why the man who liked Montgomery's poetry should have been driven away from it by Macaulay's stormy rhetoric, nor why Macaulay himself could not have let poor Montgomery alone, nor why some cowardly fellow should join in the common laugh at Tupper, when he knows very well that in his secret soul he much prefers the proverbial philosophy to Atalanta in Calydon or the Empedocles of Etna. A recent contributor to Macmillan assures us, with discouraging candor, that it is all vanity to educate ourselves into admiring Turner, and that it is not worthwhile to try and like the Mahabharata or the Origin of Species if we really enjoy King Solomon's Mines or the licensed Victualler's Gazette. On the other hand, we have Ruskin's word for it that unless we love Turner with our whole hearts, we shall not be, artistically speaking, saved, and the hosts of strenuous critics in the field of letters are each and every one assuring us that there is no intellectual future for the world unless we speedily tender our allegiance whatever he says it is due. Post-censors like Mr. Swinburne, whose words are bitterness and whose charity is small, lay crooked yokes upon our galled necks. Even the storytellers have now turned reviewers on their own account, and grovelly tell us how many novels besides their own we should feel ourselves at liberty to read. Under these circumstances, it is hardly a matter of surprise that people whose minds are, as Mr. Beggett termed it, to let, stand hesitating between license and servitude. On the one side, we hear men, intelligent men too, boasting that they never read anything but the newspapers, and seeming to take a perverted pride in their own melancholy deprivation. On the other, we see both men and women, and sometimes even children, practicing a curious sort of literary aestheticism and devoting themselves conscientiously and very conspicuously to the authors they least enjoy. These martyrs to an advanced cultivation find their self-imposed tasks, I am happy to think, grow harder year by year. Helen Pendennis, occasionally reading Shakespeare, whom she pretended to like but didn't, had comparatively an easy time of it, but her successor today, who goes to a lecture on Hegel or Euripides when she would prefer cards and conversation, who sits perplexed and doubtful through a performance of A Doll's House when little Lord Fauntleroy represents her dramatic preference, who tries to read Matthew Arnold and Turgenev and now and then Mr. Pater when she really enjoys Owen Meredith and Boodle's Baby and the Duchess, pays a heavy price for her enviable reputation. The true value of a soul's is in proportion to what they can admire, says Maurus the Epicurean, but the true value of our friends' distinction is in proportion to the books we behold in their hands. We have hardly yet outgrown the critical methods of the little heroine of Mademoiselle Panache, who knows that Lady Augusta is accomplished because she has seen her music and heard of her drawings. And as few of us resemble the late Mr. Mark Pattison in his unwillingness to create a good impression, we naturally make an effort to be taken at our best. Mr. Paine once said that Macaulay had frightened thousands into pretending they knew authors with whom they had not even a bowing acquaintance. And though the days of his autocracy are over, it has been succeeded by a more fastidious and stringent legislation. We no longer feel it incumbent upon us to profess an intimacy with Thucydides, nor to revere the Pilgrim's Progress. Indeed, a recent critic has been found brave enough to speak harsh words concerning the Delectable Mountains and the Valley of Humiliation, words that would have frozen the current of Macaulay's blood, and startled even the tolerant Saint Beuve, weary as he confessed himself of the Pilgrim's vaunted perfections. But there is always a little assortment of literary shibboleths, whose names we con over with careful glibness, when we may assert our intimacy in hours of peril, nor should we in justice be censured very severely for doing what is often, too often with us, as with the Ephremides, a deed of simple self-defense. These passwords of culture, although their functions remain always the same, vary greatly with each succeeding generation. And as they make room in turn for one another, they give to the true and modest lovers of an author a chance to enjoy him in peace. Wordsworth is now, for example, the cherished friend of a tranquil and happy band who read him placidly in green meadows or by their own firesides, and forbear to trouble themselves about the obstinate blindness of the disaffected. But there was a time when battles royal were fought over his fame, owing principally, if not altogether, to the insulting pretensions of his followers. It was then considered a correct and seemly thing to vaunt his peculiar merits, as if they were reflected a shadowy grandeur upon all who praised them. Very much in the spirit of the little Australian boy who said to Mr. Froude, "Don't you think the harbour of Sydney does us great credit?" To which the historian's characteristic reply was, "It does, my dear, if you made it." Apart from the prolonged and pointless discussion of Wordsworth's admirable moral qualities, as though he had been the candidate for a bishopric, there was always a delicately implied claim on the part of his worshippers that they possessed finer perceptions than their neighbors, that they were in some incomprehensible way open to influence which revealed nothing to less subtle and discriminating souls. The same tone of heartfelt superiority is noticeable among the very ardent admirers of Robert Browning, who seem to be perpetually offering thanks to heaven that they are not as other men, and who evince a gentle but humiliating contempt for their uninitiated fellow creatures, while Isbin's fervent devotees dwell on the mountain-top apart. How many people, I wonder, who believe that they have loved Shelley all their lives, find themselves exceedingly dazed and harassed by what Mr. Freeman calls the snares of Shelleyana, a mist of confusing chatter and distorted praise. How many unambitious readers who would fain enjoy their Shakespeare quietly are pursued even to their peaceful chimney corners by the perfidious devices of commentators and of cranks. In the meanwhile, an experienced few ally themselves with supreme but transient enthusiasm to Frederick Mistral, or to Pushkin, or Omar Khayyam, or to Emile, and an inexperienced many strive falteringly to believe that they were acquainted with the Rubaiyat before the date of Mr. Vedder's illustrations, and that the diary of a half-Germanized Frenchman submerged in a speculative and singularly cheerless philosophy represents the intellectual food for which their souls are craving. The object of criticism, it has been said, is to supply the world with a basis, a definition, which cannot be accused of lacking sufficient liberality and breadth. Yet, after applying the principle for a good many years, it is discouraging to know that what has really been afforded to us is less a basin than a battlefield, the din and tumult from which strike a discordant note in our lives. That somewhat contemptuous severity with which critics address the general public, and which the general public very stoutly resents, is urbanity itself when compared with the language which they feel themselves privileged to use to one another. Signor Armando Palico Valdez, for example, who has been recently presented to us as a clear beacon light to guide our wandering steps, has no hesitation in saying that among the vulgar, of course, he includes the greater part of those who write literary criticism and who constitute the worst vulgar, since they teach what they do not know. But this is the kind of thing that is very easy to say and carries no especial weight when said. The "of course" adds indeed a faint flavor of unconscious humor to the enviable complacency of the whole, and there is always a certain satisfaction to a generous soul in the sight of a fellow mortal so thoroughly enjoying the altitude to which he believes he has risen. Let us sit on the thrones in a purple sublimity and grind down men's bones to a pale unanimity, sings Mrs. Browning in one of her less luminous moments. And Senor Valdez and his friends respond with alacrity. We will. Unhappily, however, the greater part of those who write literary criticism, while perhaps no more vulgar than their neighbors, are not generous enough nor humorous enough to appreciate the delicate irony of the situation. They rush forward to protest with energetic ill temper, and the air is dark with warfare. Alas for those who succeed, as Montaigne observed, in giving to their harmless opinions a fatal air of importance. Alas for those who tilt with irrational chivalry at all that man holds dear. How many years have passed since Saint Evremond uttered his cynical protest against the unprofitable wisdom of reformers? And today, when one half the world devotes itself strenuously to the correction and improvement of the other half, what is the result save pretense and contention and a dismal consciousness of insecurity? More and more do we sigh for greater harmony and repose in the intellectual life. More and more do we respect the tranquil sobriety of that wise old worldling, Lord Chesterfield, who counsels every man to think as he pleases, or rather as he can, but to forbear to disclose his valuable ideas when they are of a kind to disturb the peace of society. In reading the recently published letters of Edward Fitzgerald, we cannot fail to be struck with the amount of unmixed pleasure he derived from his books, merely because he approached them with such instinctive honesty and singleness of purpose. He was perfectly frank in his satisfaction, and he was wholly innocent of any didactic tendency. Those subjects which he confessed he enjoyed because he only partly understood them, just as the old woman loves sermons, he refrained from interpreting to his friends. Those large still books, like Clarissa Harlowe, for which he shared all Tennyson's enthusiasm, he forbore to urge upon less leisurely readers. And what a world of meaning in that single line: for human delight, Shakespeare, Cervantes, and Scott. For human delight. The words sound like a caress. A whole sunny vista opens before us. Idleness and pleasure lures us gently on. A warm and mellow atmosphere surrounds us. We are invited, not driven, to be happy. I cannot but compare Fitzgerald reading Scott, for human delight, in the quiet winter evenings, with a very charming old gentleman whom I recently saw working conscientiously, so I thought, through Tolstoy's Peace and War. He sighed a little when he spoke to me and held up the book for inspection. My daughter-in-law sent it to me, he explained resignedly, and said I must be sure and read it. But, this with a sudden sense of gratitude and deliverance, thank heaven one volume was lost on the way. Now we have Mr. Andrew Lang's word for it that the Englishmen of today, those poor islanders indeed, are better acquainted with Anna Karenina than with the fortunes of Nigel, and we cannot well doubt the assertion in view of the too manifest regret with which it is uttered. But then nobody reads the fortunes of Nigel because he has been told to read it, nor because his neighbors are reading it, nor because he wants to say that he has read it. The 101 excellent reasons for becoming acquainted with Tolstoy or Ibsen resolve themselves into a single motive when we turn to Scott. It is for human delight, or nothing. And if even to children this joy has grown somewhat tasteless of late years, I fear the reason lies in their lack of healthy unconsciousness. They are taught so much they did not used to know about the correct standing of authors. They are so elaborately directed in their recreations as well as in their studies, that the old simple charm of self-forgetful absorption in a book seems well nigh lost to them. It is not very encouraging to see a bright little girl of 10 making believe she enjoys Miss Austen's novels, and to hear her mother's complacent comments thereon, when we realized how exclusively the fine, thin perfection of Miss Austen's work appeals to the mature observation of men and women, and how utterly out of harmony it must be with the crude judgment and expansive ideality of a child. I am willing to believe that these abnormally clever little people who read grown-up books so conspicuously in public love their Shakespeares and their Grecian histories and their Idyls of the King. I have seen literature of the delicately elusive order like the Marble Faun and Elise Venner and Lamia devoured with a wistful eagerness that plainly revealed the awakened imagination responding with quick delight to the sweet and subtle charm of mystery. But I am impelled to doubt the attractiveness of Thackeray to the youthful mind, even when I have just been assured that Henry Esmond is a lovely story. And I am still more skeptical as to Miss Austen's marvelous hair strokes conveying any meaning at all to the untrained faculties of a child. Can it be that our boys and girls have learned from Emerson and Carlyle not to wish to be amused? Or is genuine amusement so rare that, like Mr. Payne's young friend, they have grown reconciled to a pretended sensation and strive dutifully to make the most of it? Alas, such pretenses are not always the facile things they seem to be, and if a book is ever to become a friend to either young or old, it must be treated with that simple integrity on which all lasting amity is built. Read not to contradict and confute, says Lord Bacon, nor to believe and take for granted, nor to find talk and discourse. And in the delicate irony of this advice, we discern the satisfaction of the philosopher in having deprived the mass of mankind of the only motives which prompt them to read at all. And that is the end of that chapter. And I quite like this one. It touches on a subject that I think we still talk about today. We certainly talk about it on BookTube today. And that is this idea of good literature and bad literature, high literature and low literature, literature and genre fiction, things that we consider quality, things that we don't consider of quality. And Agnes Repplier gives the same response that many of us give today, and says that the good book, the book worth reading, is the one that gives us pleasure. There is absolutely no point in pretending to like something, in taking the word of a critic just to appear a certain way to our peers, to our friends, to our family, to our fellow readers, if we're not actually getting pleasure out of it. We shouldn't be listening to the critics at all. Sure, we can look at the critics for inspiration into what we want to read. But if we pick up a book and begin to read it and don't enjoy it, we shouldn't pretend to enjoy it just because we've been told that it's good literature. As Repplier says here, there are books that are certainly good literature, but each of us reads and receives and absorbs each book a little bit differently. And those of us who love certain books should read them. And just because you don't like a certain book, that doesn't mean it's bad. That doesn't mean that everybody else is, lying or being pretentious about liking that. It's just, different perspectives, different types of pleasure that people get from different books. And so I will leave it at that.